You won't believe what this successful CEO went through on his own airline. Posing as a regular passenger, he wanted to test the service. But what happened next will shock you. Watch till the end to see how this story unfolds and learn the truth behind his experience. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion matters. Leonard Grayson, the renowned CEO of Skyline Airlines, had always prided himself on the high standard of service his company delivered. However, he knew that a CEO's perspective could often be colored by distance from day-to-day operations. Determined to see things from his customer's point of view, he decided to take an economy-class flight on one of his own planes, dressed casually and without any sign of his status. Boarding Flight SL-204, Leonard made his way to the check-in counter early, blending in with the other passengers. Although he hoped for an unremarkable experience, he couldn't help but notice the occasional glance from airport staff who seemed curious about this well-dressed man traveling alone without any attendance or fanfare. Yet, he was used to such looks. A man of his standing, regardless of his attire, was rarely invisible. Security checks were routine, but as Leonard navigated the busy terminal, he was aware of an underlying air of subtle, almost unspoken scrutiny. Despite the offhand glances, he kept his focus steady, reminding himself that this trip was about staying under the radar and experiencing his company's service from a customer's perspective. When he finally boarded and found his seat, Leonard was pleased that his experiment had gone unnoticed by both the crew and the passengers. Taking a window seat, he sat back, quietly observing as passengers continued boarding. Everything seemed to be progressing smoothly, but when he looked up, he noticed a tall, blonde flight attendant moving down the aisle, inspecting tickets and helping passengers settle in. She was wearing a neatly pressed uniform with a bright Skyline Airlines pin, her smile warm as she greeted travelers. As she approached Leonard's row, however, her friendly demeanor shifted. She glanced over him with a look of skepticism, her brows drawn together in a way that was anything but welcoming. Stopping at his row, she leaned in and asked, "Are you in the correct seat, sir?" Her tone was overly formal, with a sharp edge that suggested she didn't fully believe he belonged there. Leonard gave a brief nod and held out his ticket. "Yes, this is my seat." She scanned it quickly, her expression unchanging, before handing it back and offering a tight, forced smile. "All right. Thank you," she muttered, and with a curt nod moved to the next row. Leonard noticed her mutter something under her breath, but he couldn't make out the words. He brushed it off, deciding to give her the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps she was simply having a long day. Settling in, Leonard continued to observe the passengers as they found their seats, and he noted the interactions between the flight attendants and the travelers. Laura, the blonde flight attendant who had questioned him, now moved down the aisle, greeting others with a friendly smile and an ease he had not seen when she had addressed him. Other passengers were welcomed with warm gestures and polite nods, and he was intrigued by the contrast. The plane soon filled up and the last passengers were seated. As the boarding doors closed, Leonard glanced over to see Laura preparing to make her way down the aisle for the initial round of in-flight service. She looked in his direction, her gaze lingering with a slight frown, before she turned to another passenger with her usual pleasant expression. Leonard felt a strange twinge of unease as she moved closer, ignoring him once more, her movements stiff whenever she passed his row. He reminded himself again that his goal was to observe, to understand the passenger experience firsthand. The reason he had come incognito was to remove any expectations of preferential treatment. But the increasingly visible tension was not something he had anticipated. Leonard turned his attention back to the view outside the window, breathing deeply and choosing to let the incident go. He was here to experience the reality of flying on his own airline after all, and perhaps the situation would improve as the flight continued. But the lingering sense of hostility, especially as Laura's interactions with other passengers remained so friendly, kept him alert. Leonard held back from addressing it immediately, instead choosing to wait and see if her attitude toward him would improve. As the flight attendants made final preparations, he leaned back in his seat, deciding that whatever he observed during this trip would become valuable insight into the reality of his airline's service standards. As the flight settled into its course, Leonard watched the flight attendants continue their work, their professionalism evident in their attentive interactions with other passengers. Laura, however, seemed to reserve a different tone and expression whenever she glanced his way. While others received polite smiles and helpful assistance, Leonard was met with quick, dismissive glances, or worse, outright indifference. After some time, Laura returned down the aisle to begin serving drinks. Leonard felt a bit parched and hoped to catch her attention politely as she came by. She reached his row, holding a tray with an assortment of refreshments, her eyes scanning over him as if he were invisible. Leonard raised his hand slightly, keeping his tone light. "Excuse me, could I get a glass of water, please?" Laura turned, her gaze cool and dismissive. "We'll get to you when we can, sir," she replied, her voice barely masking her impatience. Her tone was sharp, nearly hostile, making Leonard feel as though he were inconveniencing her just by asking. "Of course," Leonard answered politely, choosing not to challenge her reaction. He kept his tone calm, masking his surprise. He hadn't expected such blatant disregard, especially considering he was asking for the simplest of requests. As she moved on, Leonard noticed that she served each passenger after him with her usual friendly demeanor, offering drinks and even a few friendly exchanges. Her behavior seemed like more than just a passing irritation. It felt intentional. He couldn't help but wonder if he was being judged for his unassuming attire or his choice to travel alone. When she made her way back down the aisle a second time, Leonard decided to give it another chance. After all, every customer deserved equal service. Once more, he gestured slightly, trying to catch her eye, but Laura walked right past him, ignoring his attempt completely. She continued her rounds, ensuring that the other passengers were well attended, pausing to offer snacks and beverages, yet purposefully skipping his row entirely. This pattern continued, each denial adding another layer of discomfort and frustration. Determined to remain collected, Leonard leaned back, focusing on his purpose for being here. His goal was to experience the standard service his airline provided, and what he was witnessing now felt worlds apart from the values Skyline claimed to uphold. Several rows ahead, Leonard spotted Alex, the other flight attendant, serving drinks with a warm smile. Encouraged by his friendlier demeanor, Leonard attempted to catch his attention instead. When Alex approached his row, Leonard made a polite request for a meal, having noticed that food service had already begun. "Excuse me, could I possibly get something to eat?" Leonard asked, maintaining his calm tone. Alex glanced down at him, his expression hardening slightly. "Sorry, we're out of meals for now," he replied brusquely, not meeting Leonard's gaze for more than a second before moving on. Leonard observed that other passengers, even those seated just after him, were still being served their meals. This treatment seemed more deliberate with each interaction. Leonard sat back, a knot of frustration building in his chest. Not only was he being ignored, but it was as if his simple requests were met with intentional disdain. Trying to remain detached, he told himself that this was, after all, the reason for his trip, to see things as an ordinary passenger might experience them. Several minutes later, Laura made her way back up the aisle, this time carrying a tray with cups of coffee. Leonard, deciding he could at least have a warm drink, gestured discreetly, hoping this time she might respond without hostility. As she approached his row, however, her steps slowed, and Leonard noticed a faint smirk forming on her face. She leaned over as if to offer the tray, but in a swift movement she tipped it sharply, causing a cup of hot coffee to spill directly onto his lap. A searing pain spread across his skin as the hot liquid soaked through, and he couldn't hold back a quick intake of breath from the sting. Instinctively, he reached for a napkin to wipe away the coffee, but Laura made no move to assist him. Instead, she stepped back, an almost satisfied expression in her gaze. "Oh dear," she said with mock concern, her lips curving into a slight smirk. "Seems like someone's a bit clumsy today, doesn't it?" She didn't bother offering an apology or any form of assistance, leaving Leonard stunned and painfully aware of the disdainful stares from the surrounding passengers. "Could I at least get a napkin?" he asked, his voice controlled but firm. Laura raised a brow, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she replied, "Sorry, sir, we're all out." Without another word, she walked off, leaving Leonard to deal with the mess on his own. Leonard felt the weight of judgmental stares from other passengers, his face flushed from the embarrassment and discomfort. The hostility, the calculated manner in which she had ignored and humiliated him, each action felt like a personal affront. He couldn't help but wonder if anyone else noticed how glaringly unprofessional her behavior had become. Trying to regain his composure, Leonard took a deep breath. His airline, Skyline, was built on principles of respect and high service standards, but his experience on this flight had shown the complete opposite. He had come here to observe, to gain insights on how his passengers were treated, and each moment only intensified his realization that significant changes were needed. As he sat back, Leonard resolved to continue observing without reaction. For now, he would maintain his silence, biding his time until he had a full understanding of what his customers might be enduring. But one thing was clear. He was now more determined than ever to address these issues directly. By now, Leonard's patience was wearing thin. The humiliation he had endured from Laura and Alex went beyond the dismissive looks and unfriendly responses. Their treatment had escalated into open hostility, with each interaction becoming a deliberate insult. As he waited for any remaining service to continue, Leonard noticed Laura at the far end of the cabin, her gaze pointedly avoiding him as she tended to the other passengers. She was now smiling, even laughing with some of them, showing none of the animosity that had colored her interactions with him. It was clear that her behavior toward him was no accident. An hour passed, and Leonard decided to make one final attempt to break the tense silence and receive the service every other passenger seemed to enjoy. When Laura passed by, he politely said, "Excuse me, could I get a drink of water, please?" Laura stopped, a look of irritation crossing her face as she turned to him. "You again?" she muttered, her tone dismissive. "We're serving everyone, sir, as you can see." "But I haven't received anything," Leonard replied, managing to keep his voice calm. He could feel the tension mounting, but he refused to let it show. This was still his experiment, his test of his airline standards, no matter how badly the experience was unfolding. Laura gave him a tight-lipped smile that held no warmth. "Well, I'm sorry if you're unhappy with the service," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But we can't cater to everyone's expectations now, can we? Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away. Leonard, feeling the weight of other passengers' eyes on him, sat back in his seat. He wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding or an isolated incident, but her words and actions suggested otherwise. This was a targeted effort to make him feel unwelcome, to remind him he was an outsider. As the flight continued, Laura's behavior only worsened. She and Alex passed his row multiple times, offering drinks, snacks, and warm towels to everyone around him, but ignoring him entirely. Each time Leonard tried to speak, they brushed past him, dismissing him as though he didn't exist. He could no longer deny the sense of alienation, of being purposely ostracized, that seemed to permeate every interaction. Finally, as the plane began its descent and passengers started preparing for landing, Leonard noticed a change in Laura's expression. She exchanged glances with Alex, her face settling into a look of distaste. Before Leonard could even consider asking for help or requesting anything else, Laura approached him once more. "Sir," she said in a voice loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "we've had some complaints from other passengers about your behavior. Apparently, you've been disruptive and difficult." Leonard's mouth fell open in shock. He had barely spoken to anyone except to request basic service, and he knew he hadn't caused any disturbance. But Laura's words rang out clearly, and he could sense other passengers turning to glance in his direction, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. "Excuse me?" he replied, doing his best to stay calm. "I haven't done anything to disrupt anyone." Laura raised a brow, crossing her arms as she continued her accusation. "We've been informed that you refuse to follow instructions, and you've been making unreasonable demands throughout the flight," she said, her tone sharp and accusing. "Unfortunately, we'll need you to remain seated until further notice. Security will be meeting you once we land." Leonard felt the weight of her words settle over him like a storm. His heart raced as he realized the full extent of her intentions. She wasn't just being unprofessional. She was actively trying to humiliate him, using her authority to frame him as a disruptive passenger in front of everyone. Trying to keep his composure, he replied, "I haven't refused any instructions, nor have I done anything disruptive. I've only requested the same service given to everyone else." Alex joined her, standing close by and adding fuel to the fire. "We don't have time to argue, sir," he said in a dismissive tone. "Just stay seated, and we'll handle this once the plane is on the ground." Leonard sat back, stunned and helpless as the flight attendants walked away, ignoring his protests. He looked around, searching the faces of nearby passengers for any sign of understanding, but most of them avoided his gaze, unwilling to involve themselves. His sense of isolation deepened, and he felt the sting of humiliation settle in as he realized how completely he had been targeted by the crew. By the time the plane landed, Leonard was mentally preparing himself for what awaited him on the ground. He knew that revealing his true identity now wouldn't do any good. If anything, it would only make him seem defensive or combative. He needed to approach this with calm, determined resolve, and let the situation play out until he had the opportunity to explain. Once the plane taxied to a stop, Laura and Alex stood near the front, exchanging satisfied glances. Leonard could see their smug expressions as they waited, clearly expecting to witness him humiliated further. He took a deep breath, centering himself, and prepared to handle whatever accusations they would make against him. Finally, the doors opened, and a security officer boarded the plane, moving toward Leonard's row. Leonard could feel the tension among the passengers as they watched, and he did his best to keep his expression neutral. He would deal with this calmly, taking careful note of every detail for what he knew would be a critical meeting after the flight. "Sir, please come with us," the officer said, his tone firm but professional. Leonard stood, giving Laura and Alex a last, calm look before following the officer down the aisle. As he walked past them, he could see the satisfaction in their eyes, their belief that they had successfully humiliated him. But Leonard held his ground, keeping his dignity intact. This was not the end of the journey. It was merely the beginning of a confrontation that would uncover every truth he had set out to learn. He knew that, soon enough, they would realize who he was, and that every action they had taken would be exposed and justice would be served. As he exited the plane, Leonard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The blatant, deliberate disrespect he had endured had only fueled his determination to confront this issue head-on. He had come to see what his passengers experienced, and now he knew he would use this experience to make real changes. Escorted down the jetway and into the terminal by the security officer, Leonard kept his composure. His heart was pounding, but his expression remained calm. Despite the deep humiliation he had endured on his own airline, he knew this confrontation was far from over. It was now time to reveal his true identity and demand accountability from everyone involved. As they approached a small waiting area, the security officer motioned for him to wait while he spoke with a supervisor. Leonard stood still, his face impassive, though inside, he felt the tension mounting. This was the moment he had prepared for. The time when he would finally make clear who he was and ensure these actions didn't go unanswered. Soon, a smartly dressed man in a suit entered the room, his expression tense and concerned as he looked at Leonard. The man introduced himself as Thomas Weston, Skyline Airlines operations manager. His eyes widened in surprise as he began to register Leonard's face. "Mr. Grayson?" Thomas asked, his voice wavering slightly as realization dawned. You're Leonard Grayson?" Leonard gave him a steady nod. "Yes, that's correct," he replied. "I am the CEO of Skyline Airlines, and I've just experienced the kind of service our passengers encounter every day. And let me tell you, it was unacceptable." Thomas's face went pale as he processed this information. He took a step back, visibly shaken, and struggled to find his words. "Mr. Grayson, I had no idea. Please accept my deepest apologies. This should never have happened. I'm so sorry." Leonard held up a hand to silence him. "Apologies won't change what happened," he said firmly. "I've been ignored, humiliated, and physically restrained by members of my own crew, simply because they believed I was an ordinary passenger. Their behavior reflects directly on our company's values, and I intend to address it immediately." Thomas nodded quickly, pulling out a notepad to jot down Leonard's words. "Of course, Mr. Grayson. I will personally see to it that every individual involved in this incident faces consequences. This behavior is inexcusable, and I assure you we'll launch a full investigation." "I need more than just promises, Thomas," Leonard replied, his voice steady but sharp. "Effective immediately. I want every member of that flight's crew removed from duty, and I want this incident fully documented in their records. This is not simply about punishment. It's about upholding the standards that Skyline is supposed to represent." Thomas nodded again, his hands shaking slightly as he scribbled Leonard's instructions. "Understood, Mr. Grayson. I'll make sure it's done." Leonard studied Thomas for a moment, gauging his sincerity. Although he sensed genuine horror in the man's response, he wasn't ready to leave anything to chance. The events on that flight had revealed a culture that permitted, and even encouraged, prejudice and abuse. A culture that had to be dismantled from its roots. "There's one more thing," Leonard continued, his tone softening but still firm. I want to confront the crew personally. They need to understand exactly who I am and the gravity of their actions. Thomas's eyes widened, and he hesitated, clearly taken aback by the request. But he nodded, a look of determination settling over his face. "Yes, sir. I'll have them brought to a private conference room immediately." After a few minutes, Thomas led Leonard down a quiet corridor to a small, sterile conference room. Inside, the crew members, Laura, Alex, and Jackson, the pilot, were seated, their expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. They had clearly not been informed of what was happening, and Leonard could see the faint traces of smug satisfaction on their faces, unaware of the situation they now faced. As Leonard entered, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Laura's eyes widened in shock as she recognized him, her smug expression quickly vanishing. Alex's mouth dropped open, his gaze darting between Leonard and Thomas in disbelief. Jackson, the pilot, clenched his fists, his face a mix of irritation and disbelief. Leonard took a deep breath, letting the silence settle over the room before he spoke. "I'm sure you all recognize me now," he began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that sent a chill through the room. "I am Leonard Grayson, the CEO of Skyline Airlines, and I want you all to understand that your actions have not only violated basic standards of decency, but they have also disgraced the values this company claims to uphold." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze steady and unyielding. "During that flight, I was treated as though I were less than human, ignored, insulted, and even restrained without cause. All because you assumed I was simply another passenger who didn't deserve respect. You ignored your duty, abused your power, and brought shame to this airline." Laura looked down, her face red with shame as she stammered, "Mr. Grayson, I didn't realize." Leonard cut her off, his tone cold. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Every passenger deserves respect, whether they're the CEO or not. Your actions speak volumes about how you view those who don't meet your personal standards. That's unacceptable." Alex shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Leonard's gaze. "Mr. Grayson, I've worked here for years. This is the first time. One chance was all you needed to reveal your true character," Leonard interrupted, "and your actions have shown me exactly who you are. The standards of this airline, my airline, demand respect for every customer, and you have failed to uphold that." Jackson, the pilot, tried to interject, his face twisting in frustration. "This was just a misunderstanding, Mr. Grayson. We were only doing our job controlling a passenger who—" Leonard's expression hardened. "You chose to ignore my compliance and instead treated me with open hostility. I followed every instruction, remained calm, and asked for nothing beyond basic courtesy. But you chose to act with cruelty because you thought there would be no consequences." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching the weight of his accusations bear down on them. "Effective immediately, all of you are terminated from your positions at Skyline Airlines. Your actions will be documented in your records, and I will personally ensure that any future employer is made aware of the nature of this incident." Silence filled the room as the crew processed his words. Laura's face crumpled, her shoulders shaken as she began to cry, the full magnitude of her actions finally dawning on her. Alex looked down, and his face pale, his composure shattered. Jackson clenched his fists, but his expression betrayed the dawning realization that there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. Leonard watched them, feeling a sense of justice settle over him. He had come here hoping to confirm that his airline's values were being upheld, but he had been met with a harsh truth. Still, he was determined to rebuild Skyline on a foundation of respect and integrity. "I hope this serves as a lesson," he said, his voice final, "that every passenger on my airline deserves respect, regardless of appearance or background, and I will tolerate nothing less." With that, Leonard turned and left the room, his heart heavy but resolute. The road ahead would require more than just firings. It would demand a complete reevaluation of Skyline's culture, a systemic overhaul to root out prejudice and ensure every employee represented the values he had worked so hard to instill. Walking through the terminal, Leonard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had endured the worst treatment, seen the worst of humanity in the faces of his own employees, but he had also witnessed the power of accountability, the importance of standing up for what was right. As he stepped outside, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his experience lift slightly. He knew there was much work to be done, but he was prepared to take on the challenge. For Leonard Grayson, this journey had only just begun. A journey to ensure that Skyline became a place where every passenger was treated with the respect they deserved. And that is how one shocking experience turned into a mission for change. This CEO learned the hard truth about his airline, and now he's determined to make sure no passenger ever faces such disrespect again. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more powerful stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in his place? Your opinion matters.